I will ask a question first about that. And that is, the name of the event is this nerdy on or off-chain thing. And I'm curious about what you all think are the limitations of what sort of computation should happen on-chain versus off-chain. Like how far can it go and how far should it go?
Big question.
Okay, I can start. I don't think everything should be on-chain. I think it's obvious. But I think critical parts of, for example, the apps should be on-chain. I think we have seen many hacks that were the result of things not being on-chain enough. For NFTs, I don't know if you have read the blog post of the creator of Signal. I think it's very inspiring. I think it demonstrates the limitation of storing everything off-chain. So I think it depends on truly the answer is that it depends on the thing that you are doing. I think there's no point in storing. It depends also on the chain. Like what Filecoin is doing and what we are doing is extremely different, but also very complementary. We don't want to put video assets on the Massa chain. It's not worth it. It will be. You don't want to replicate videos of cats on a ledger that is shared by 10,000 or 100,000 nodes. It simply does not scale. So it's not doable, and you don't want to do it.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, actually. Like, I'm more of an advocate of Web 2.5. Anything that is, well, I mean, whatever you want to call it, Web 5, Web 2.5, what's the current name, marketing name is? I don't know. But yeah, I don't think everything needs to necessarily be on-chain, but there's different ways to make that verifiable and immutable. Things like IPFS, obviously, are still doing that. And you can create, like, whole pathways and make your data secure with protocols like that. So maybe we need a bit of a rethink of how we're doing things, and we still want them to be fast as well, which is like a big problem with blockchains. So
this can be controversial. As little as possible. Blockchains are important for global distributed consensus. If you don't need global distributed consensus, it shouldn't go on chain. Just like if you don't need to put things with a cloud provider, you probably shouldn't put it there. And increasingly, we have the techniques and the technology to keep things really close to the user and only synchronize the little bits that you actually need, right? So even if we get massive throughput on chain, right, it's still going to be high throughput, high latency, and that's not what we need for absolutely everything, and not everyone needs to have a copy of that data, right? So having a commitment on chain often makes sense, but not for everything, right? So I think instead of in Web3 immediately reaching for, we should put this on chain, we should think about how much consensus do we have? How much do I need everyone to agree on this bit of data? In the same way that I don't keep the internal state of my website while it's executing in AWS.
I can just +1 to what Brooke said. Yeah.
I have a feeling that if I were answering a question after Brooke, I would just say +1 as well. A question back here. I will bring you this and hope not to have feedback.
Yeah, in the future, I'll throw a microphone to you, at you.
So when we talk about decentralized off-chain compute, there's first question is like, does every bit of outputs of a function of compute off-chain need to be validated? First question. I don't know. It seems like the answer is yes, but if everything does need to be validated to be on-chain, there seems to be two models of doing it. One is the optimistic model, and I'm not really talking just about rollups here. I'm talking about like TrueBit was essentially the optimistic model where it's good until people challenge it, right? Or sort of inherently validated by zero knowledge, right? So those seem to me to be the two poles. If you guys think there's a wider design space, let me know. In both cases, there's serious challenges for like larger scale compute. In the optimistic case, you obviously have to, if anybody challenges, you re-execute everything, which if you're doing a machine learning training and somebody challenges, well, forget about it. And then you can't really do a zero knowledge proof on massive computations yet today either. So in both cases, it seems like we have sort of constraints on the sort of like upper bounds of how much you can do. I mean, if you guys are willing to comment on the design space for validating off-chain compute, as well as what like, as well as what constraints are in any particular direction.
Okay. So to sort of set the field first, right? Like we're talking specifically about things that you would want to then put on chain. Not all computation should, right? So like if you're doing machine learning and there's a lot of randomness and you won't ever be able to get that exact result back again, maybe less useful. Sending text messages with my friends, probably less useful to put a commitment on chain, right? So there's lots of things where you don't need verifiability, right? Which is really the core of what you're talking about. Something that I was introduced to last week that I'm a big fan of is Wan's triangle, right? One-Bennett's triangle, which is you can have two of the three: speed, verifiability, and privacy, right? So if you put compute in EC2, it's going to run really fast, but you're not going to have any verifiability on it. As soon as you go to, say, a zero-knowledge proof or even an optimistic setup, anything like that, you're losing speed immediately. And there's no way around that because you're doing more work, right? Like, if you want to add privacy, so you have, say, fully homomorphic encryption, it's going to be really slow. And if you want to have something that's private and verifiable, it's going to be extremely slow, right? So I think it's a matter of picking what are the trade-offs in this bit of computation, right? Zero-knowledge proofs are amazing, right? And they're getting faster, and same thing with FHE. It's getting faster, but it'll never be as fast as running it on a server trusted, right? And there are absolute use cases for that still. And you can still take the output of that, or say, I ran this with these parameters and these, et cetera, and post a commitment to that to say, hey, this is the answer I got back, and I'm just going to signal that, and maybe that's enough. But I think there's an entire spectrum that goes from fully trusted to fully verifiable and private, and you're trading off various things in the middle.
+1.
Is there an FVM take on this or a Massa take that's any nuanced or different?
I totally agree with what has been said. I couldn't say it better. I think we really need to think more of a blockchain as a tool among other tools and stop having... It was, at some point, the slogan was decentralize everything, but I don't think we need to decentralize everything. There will be use cases for centralized server always, but there are some things that need to be on-chain, that are better on-chain, there are things that are better off-chain, there are things that are better on-chain that are somewhat centralized. There's space for everyone, I think. Yeah. If
everyone agrees it's boring and we stop. You can also ask just like a basic question if you have something. Like, didn't understand something?
Here comes a microphone.
Be prepared.
Hello. Are there any techniques that you haven't, or like primitives or larger than that you haven't talked about yet that are in the literature but aren't, that you haven't mentioned yet and aren't really ready for implementation, in the last 12 months, but are on your radar in the realm of like the topic of this, which is decentralized computation and storage? So things from the literature, cryptographic literature, whatever, that aren't in play yet, but are on your radar that you think we should look into?
That we haven't explored at all, or thinking about it? We haven't explored it at all, or we're just thinking about it?
Just that are underrepresented in the implementation space, but are, just like zero-knowledge proofs were not so implemented 5 years ago.
There's an answer from the audience behind you. Crowdsourcing.
I think there's one example that I know about that's outside of the sort of like polarity of optimistic versus zero knowledge. There's and honestly, I don't even know. It's unclear if it'll work. And it's for a very specific set of computations. But a protocol called Jensen, which we're invested in. They're borrowing from some academic papers as well. They think they found a way to create a proof out of gradient descent. So any computation which involves stochastic gradient descent, you can essentially create like a proof of work out of it, because it's hard to reverse, and it's hard to take the outputs, go to the inputs. So it sort of resembles a like SHA-256 hash proof of work. That's that's kind of like one specific example maybe, but that's the only break from that like polarity that I can think of. Sorry, I don't want to dominate any air either.
Well, now that you've spoken, you have to introduce yourself. Now that you're a content provider and not just a question asker.
Yeah.
Yeah, who are you?
Yeah, sorry. Will Nelly, I invest for Galaxy Digital.
Lovely to have you, Will. Thank you.
So I'll be slightly devil's advocate just to make this more interesting. Yeah. So I'm Sander from Textile, and yeah, I just wanted to mention that I totally agree with not everything has to be on chain. But I think what's often overlooked, is that on chain is kind of like it's like a cloud-like experience in a way. So there's a usability thing that I think we as like engineers often overlook. So we have built a Textile, like a peer-to-peer database, and it's just an endless feature request of, how do you do this? Like, I need to be able to revoke access. That's really hard. Local first, or peer-to-peer, things like that. But with on-chain, you can achieve something like a cloud experience where you can mud puddle your phone. You don't have to. I can't tell you how much time we spent working on like recovering backups on a peer-to-peer database network. So yeah, that's just to push back just a little bit. Usability, I think, is often overlooked in these conversations. So, yeah. A little bit of.
You wanted that to be controversial, and yet.
Yep.
What was the controversial part?
That perhaps we could think of, you said like text messages with your friends. I actually think that is not a terrible use case for on-chain, because you do get that cloud-like experience, especially as chains become cheaper and cheaper. I don't need my text to be sent in 10 milliseconds, Like it could be 200, or even a second would be totally fine. So if the transaction is super low, if the cost of it's super low, and it's not, we have data availability layers elsewhere. Those can be separated from the whole thing. I think even use cases like that can be thought of as potential for on-chain.
Can I riff on this to make it controversial?
Please, yeah.
This is Boris from Fission. Does the shelling point of the EVM and quotation marks composability cause any design collapse in the multi-chain universe?
Why are you looking at me, Boris? If there's no answer from the panel, you have to answer it for us. Do we understand the question?
Should I rephrase?
Yes.
I know him a little bit. He's my co-founder. So in essence, what he's asking is, if we assume that the Ethereum virtual machine has won because it's getting included everywhere, and everyone is including EVM compatibility, right? So what does that constrain us to? What use cases does that limit us to? And are we giving up the ability to easily upgrade and add features over time when it's like at its core, people are saying, well, we'll do whatever Ethereum's doing. Is that roughly? Translation accepted.
Thank you. Takes?
Yeah, I mean, I somewhat agree, but from our side, we decided not to follow EVM. So because there were some limitation, like for example, asynchronous messages are not possible on EVM. So this is something that made us choose our own virtual machine. But I think we mostly need to work on ways to communicate cross-chain. Like I think IBC is maybe a good point. I don't know, but this is definitely. I think it's more about communication protocol, cross-chain communication protocols, the solution rather than all doing EVM. I don't know. I don't think it's a good solution. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like horses for courses, right? It's another engineering challenge. What are you looking to achieve, and what chain does that properly for you? I understand, like, you know, we are adding Ethereum compatibility because that is where the community is at the moment, right? And we have to do that. Like, you can't. I mean, it's a much harder journey if you're not adding EVM compatibility, even though, you know, that may mean that some of our features aren't as rich on that EVM compatibility. We're still creating like the actual chain on its own though as well. So there is a native chain, is what I'm trying to say, a native layer 1, which will, you know, add way more functionality. But in the meantime, you still have to build out community, or you can't, you have a failed and unusable protocol or layer 1 from the beginning, right? So I think that's a part that you have to, if we're going to do a Venn diagram or another triangle, like there's, you know, community as well as technicals, as well as, you know, what's your engineering use case. So
From what I know about the FVM project, the focus, right? And for a lot of these projects, right? It's like they have 3 focuses: adoption, adoption, and adoption, right? So yeah, it totally makes sense why. Something that we often say internally at Fission is the EVM is a little bit like WordPress from the last generation, right? Like it certainly wasn't the most technically perfect design, but it won because, you know, it was a shelling point. People got behind it. It had enough of a community behind it. Anyone who was in Iceland last week is going to laugh because I'm going to say this phrase again. If you've ever heard the phrase "worse is better," right? It's this old article from the, I guess, 1991, somewhere there. And worth reading. Like, definitely, that's everyone's homework is to go read this article. But the core idea is you can have something that is objectively worse today, or equivalent even, but if it has enough people behind it and there's enough people working to improve it, then 10 years from now it'll be better, right? Now, asterisks, if people work to improve it, right? So my personal belief is that there needs to be a group that is working on the EVM that is not just Ethereum mainnet and Ethereum core devs, if everybody's using it, right? But, you know, that doesn't exist yet, so.
Is that sort of what FVM is, as one example? Like you have an abstraction layer that sits on top of something deeper. Would you propose changes up to your EVM layer?
We definitely could, I suppose. We'd have to talk to the technical architects. But yeah, look, FVM is, you know, we're building on WASM, right? And we've got a Rust implementation and an assembly script implementation coming soon. So it's not Ethereum designed underneath. We're just creating Ethereum compatibility so we can bring the community to, you know, building on a storage layer as well. So
Yeah, I think it's the best place to start right now. That's how I put it. Like, it's not where you want to end up, like talking to what Boris said, but I think it's the best way to start building it and then go from there. But
I do like the idea of like floating up to, you know, where do we float ideas up as other chains to the Ethereum community? I guess in public, but I like that idea a lot.
Yeah. So the other thing to note with using, and this is maybe the more controversial part of the panel, we finally got there. If a chain adopts a standard owned by another group, they're not in control of that. And so the question is, who's in charge of upgrading that compatibility? So if the Ethereum core devs decide to radically revamp the EVM, all of these other chains now have to shift, right? So maybe they should be giving this back, or maybe they should create an organization that's decoupled from Ethereum, right? That is stewarding this virtual machine, which is, aside from WebAssembly and V8, probably the most important VM that we have today.
Do they need to do it? Or in a decentralized fashion, could one of these other chains just start it and win?
Literally anyone could do it. The hard part with all of these things is getting people behind you, right? And getting the momentum. So in the same way that worse is better, you need to get the people moving. It's at the bottom, it's always about governance and about people, as much as we like to think it's about the tech.
So I think as Adrien was like, cross-chain communication protocols are useful. So I'm curious what people think are like good elements of a cross-chain communication protocol that don't, that are expressive enough to be a big tent, but specific enough to be useful, or worse is better, for in making invocations cross-chain, basically.
I don't know exactly how to answer this question. I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer it, because I think it's a good. I like the idea. I think it's the right way to do it, but I don't know about exact way it should be done. It's something we just started studying, but I don't see. For me, it's the right way to make blockchains compatible, because at some point I think a standard should emerge, and so that people don't do bridges that are between chain. It's a big point, a single point of failure bridges. So I think we should work on this. I think it's very needed.
I'd like to queue up the FVM people. Do you want to talk about your hypervisor?
Yes, please. Let's see here. No. I actually think Textile might have a few answers to this.
But he was texting, so he's confused.
I can repeat the question.
Textile.
Considering they've been doing some bridges.
You have to go the box back.
So the question was, how do the bridges work?
What are the elements of a good cross-chain communication protocol for invoking methods in decentralized computation?
Well, so just briefly, our bridges are not decentralized. So we built essentially an auction system on Filecoin, and we have a little small program called a bid bot that storage providers run, and they can partake in these auctions. So the bridge is really just a way to deposit funds for the bids. It's not really decentralized at all. We were trying to solve a usability problem with Filecoin, which is, hey, I just want to upload some data and have it stored. I don't want to have to think about it. And to your point earlier about not having a good way to replicate data between storage providers, that system we built does that. But it was kind of a stopgap to something like what you're doing now, which is the right solution. We actually looked at doing something like an L2 on Filecoin to do the auction system in a decentralized way, but that was on your roadmap, so I'll leave that to you.
What did you have?
But I'm not really getting at the question. I don't know if I have a great answer of how to do that in a really good decentralized way without thinking about it more.
So I have a question for the group, actually, and like sort of general show of hands. Who's interested in there being bridges at all? Cool. How many people are comfortable with, and like genuinely no judgment either way, right? How many people are comfortable with centralized bridges and would use them? Okay. And of those people, how many people would prefer a first party, something baked into the protocol? Boris does. Okay, cool.
A first party what?
So something baked into the protocol rather than run by some central entity.
Yes. Then I think everyone would, right?
Yeah.
You all would. Was there a question about hypervisor that didn't get addressed and it got deflected?
Sorry, it might be, especially for the 18 seconds left, it might be too much. The FVM has an abstraction, so they use WebAssembly and like EVM written in WebAssembly, but in theory, you could add more VMs to that, and then they have an invocation model so that you can talk between WebAssembly and EVM and whatever else gets plugged in there later. So it may have had some interesting insights, but we're at 0. So
Sorry, I missed that question.
They might come
need
up
a
during
job.
the breaks, too. That's the wonderful thing about being here. Before we end, I do want to ask a question. Is there anyone here who should have answered that question? Don't answer it now, so you don't have to do it in front of everyone, but if there's anyone who has a good answer to the question about cross-chain communication. You're volunteering. Oh, there you are. There he is. You can talk to Juan later on. So there you go. All right, thank you so much to the panelists.